Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session on Iraq. Iraq has faded from the headlines in recent years, but that's arguably been a good thing. In some ways, the country is more stable than it has been in a long time. 2 decades since the fall of Saddam Hussein, the internal conflict stemming from the US-led invasion of 2003 and the establishment of the so-called Islamic State's caliphates have largely been overcome. But of course, challenges remain. Among them, there are still enduring sectarian tensions. There's difficult relationship between Baghdad and the semi-autonomous Kurdish region, and the growing influence of pro-Iranian political blocs and militias. Internationally, Iraq faces the difficult challenge of balancing its relationship with Iraq and the US, and of course, the ripple effects of the wars in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere in the Middle East. There are fears of a resurgent Islamic State, and the conditions indeed are ripe for that to happen. ISIS has, after all, its deepest roots in Iraq. And in this context, the US recently announced it will pull out almost all of its remaining 2,500 troops from the country. And as we all know, a new US administration is soon going to come to power. Joining me today are Dlawer Al-Aldin, the founding president of the Middle East Research Institute. Welcome. Rand Al-Aldin, the director of the Middle East Peace and Security Forum and a researcher at Oxford University. And Lahib Hijel, senior analyst at the International Crisis Group. Welcome. We will start with a question for Dlawer. To what extent would you agree that Iraq is indeed going through a phase of relative political stability?
Okay, thank you very much. I would say yes. From outside, obviously, our definition of stability is that it should fade away into the background, and that's what it's doing. And inside, stability for us is what we have, because our level of tolerance of instability is huge. People underestimate how much we can tolerate internal problems, crises, because sometimes when we are between crises, we create them ourselves, or when we deal with crises, we invent another one. So Iraq has a high threshold for that. But let me start with something else, and that is, this morning, the Prime Minister of Iraq held a press conference to announce the numbers, the population census, and today we are now 45,400,000 plus. And if you consider the 400,000 plus being either refugees from Syria, plus foreigners residing, so we are now 45 million, and we're increasing by more than 1 million each year. So adding to your list of reasons why Iraq has not been stable, there is another explosive situation where we don't have job for all those people. And 60% of those that I mentioned are actually in the working age between 15 and 65. And 35%, 36% of the population are actually under 15. So imagine what's coming. This coinciding with weak institutions, fragmented politics, a very complex dynamics of politics, and competitive authoritarianism that is evolving, that makes it difficult to govern Iraq in a continuous, stable manner for a long time. So we have these cycles of internal competition over power, over resources, over everything. And we also have difficult center-periphery relationship. These are on top of the state, non-state actor factors that are still very strong, that is tested every now and then by external stimulus like the Gaza war and the reaction and potential of escalation. We would have two minds, two states, two behaviors that we cannot guarantee where we are going with. So the economics, the security, the social as well as political instability or potential, say, or drivers of instability are still there, because we have structural problems that are not dealt with even by the current government, who's actually now, one can say, the best government we've had for a long time. because this government came out of a huge crisis of instability, violent eruption of conflict between parties in Baghdad. But now we have a government that for the last 2 years have been focused on the economy, on services, had a huge budget approved in the parliament to start infrastructure projects, to engage the neighbors as well as powers further afield in a constructive way that makes Iraqis feel a bit confident about sovereignty and stability. So while this government has managed to do that, and relations between Erbil and Baghdad improved, relations with the United States improved, so all that gives you the impression that Iraq is more stable now. But the structural problems and the dynamics are still there, provoked or under pressure. It may reveal the weaknesses that we have failed to address. And this time, if it erupts, we cannot blame foreigners for that. It's our own leaders we have to blame for failing to achieve state building and nation building over 21 years post-regime change.
Thank you. Maybe we can focus a little bit on one of these aspects, which is, of course, security. Prime Minister al-Sudani has repeatedly said that Iraq is a sovereign state and that Iraqi troops are fully capable of dealing with its own challenges, including Islamic State. What is your assessment of the capability of Iraq's security forces? And in this context, what role are the popular mobilization forces playing? And what are the pitfalls, potential pitfalls in this group having like a bigger role in Iraq's security?
Thanks very much. Well, firstly, a huge thanks to ISPI, the organizers, for putting this panel together. Hats off to whoever chose the title, very thought-provoking. I'd say Iraq's tomorrow is Iraq's today and Iraq's yesterday, but that can be a good and bad thing. To answer your question, I think we need to look at Iraq on 3 levels. One is internationally, regionally, and domestically. Internationally, Iraq, for all its problems and challenges, has actually done a fantastic job with maintaining its strategic partnerships, with maintaining its strong reputational standing as a security partner, particularly when it comes to counter-terrorism. And what we're seeing is really the regional and the international overlap in that respect. And that's something which the Americans in particular, but also the Europeans have encouraged, namely that Iraq uses its international credibility, leverage, relationships to actually achieve objectives in the region. And that's why I think, as Lawa mentioned, we're seeing a lot of momentum when it comes to how Iraq engages the region at large. We all know that Iraq has a very good, strong partnership with Iran. Over the past 4 or 5 years, towards the end of former Prime Minister Kadhimi's administration, and picked up on that by Prime Minister Sudani, is improved relations with the Arab world, in addition to Turkey. So some of you might have heard of the Iraq Development Road Project, which is a transformational infrastructure project that positions Iraq as a major hub for regional trade and economic integration. That brings several positive geopolitical reverberations. Aside from giving, I'd say, almost all of the main regional actors a stake in Iraq's stability and prosperity, it also actually insulates Iraq from regional escalation, including the one that we're seeing unfold right now. So some of you are aware that Iraq faces a potential quote unquote imminent strike from the Israelis on certain factions in Iraq, namely the PMF factions, Iran-aligned groups, and so on, in addition to their infrastructure. Now that could be post-US election posturing from the Israelis. I'm still skeptical that it will happen at this particular juncture, but it does give you an indication of what might be on the horizon for Iraq. And unfortunately for Iraq as a country, things do look like they will get worse. But on what level, to what extent, that's the question mark. Now on that, when it comes to Iraq, it's normally fairly easy to come to doomsday conclusions. But what we've seen since the October 7 escalation is that sometimes our apocalyptic scenarios for the region tend to be unfounded. So the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the unprecedented tit-for-tat escalation between the Iranians and the Israelis, For most people, if you'd said that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even 7, 8 months ago, they would have told you those events would signal a full-fledged conflict, if not World War III. That hasn't materialized. And that tells you a number of things. Number one, that there is no appetite for a major full-scale regional conflagration. I think we're going to see countries like Iraq play an important role in calming tensions. Coming to the PMF, in that context, Iraq faces a problem, a conundrum. The PMF is a formal member of the Iraqi state and government. Once upon a time, it could launch attacks at will with impunity because it could rely on Iraqi sovereignty. It was simply a rogue a militia force, and therefore it couldn't be held accountable. But when you're part of the system itself, then you are bringing that system at risk of retaliatory attacks, sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge for Prime Minister Soudani moving forward is how do you rein in these actors or establish a dialogue with them in order to simply manage and de-escalate tensions. Now, coming back to the region, I think the region as a whole needs to play its part in making sure Iraq doesn't become a hotspot for a regional conflict. And because of economic integration initiatives, like Development Road, but others as well, they've got actually an interest in making sure Iraq doesn't become a battleground. Secondly, I think Iraq is in a great position to play a more proactive mediating role between the Iranians and the Americans. I think the next administration in the US, the Trump administration, will be turning more and more to the Iraqi political class at large to rely on those back-channel communication processes to try and relay messages to the Iranians to de-escalate tensions. But coming to the domestic climate in Iraq, and that involves the PMF, Iraq has had a major civil war on 2 occasions over the past decade: the sectarian Sunni Arab Shia conflict, the emergence of ISIS. Iraq was so close just 2 years ago to an intra-Shia civil war. That hasn't yet materialized in Iraq, and I think all focus and attention will be on how do you prevent the regional crisis from reverberating domestically, because what you'll see is more extremist, more hardline militant groups emerge as the regional escalation unfolds and worsens. And I think that's where Prime Minister Soudani, perhaps with other political actors, can play a huge moderating role when it comes to that next major conflagration domestically.
I mean, is there a risk that the PMFs could turn Iraq into an Iranian client state?
Well, according to some, it already has turned Iraq into a client state. I don't think we'll see a Hezbollahization of Iraq. I'm skeptical of that because in Lebanon, you've got one Hezbollah, and they've spent, since their inception, a very long time capturing the state itself. Iraq has probably 3 Hezbollah-like organizations, 2 or 3 other secondary organizations that want to emulate Hezbollah. And in addition, you've got other cross-sectarian ethnic political groups, armed groups, that in a way create an equilibrium. That equilibrium and balance in Iraq is so crucial to making sure Iraq doesn't become engulfed in a civil war, but also secondly, doesn't get caught up in the regional escalation. And that's where I'd say I'm most positive about Iraq avoiding the conflagration. But we will see an intensification of military measures against PMF factions. We'll see a tightening of US sanctions on Iraq as a whole. The worst could come if Iraq as a state is sanctioned by the Americans, because that would effectively take the country back to the 1990s and the Stone Ages, essentially, by crippling the country and its economy.
Well, thank you. Speaking of which, I have a question for you, Lahib. Of course, one of Iraq's greatest assets are its hydrocarbons. Crude oil exports revenue still makes up something like 95% of Iraq's government revenues, with $100 billion a year in revenues. Can you talk a little bit about Iraq's economy and specifically how good a job is Iraq doing at managing its oil windfall and investing that windfall in infrastructure or in other ways, and at the same time and moving away from oil, diversifying its economy?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for setting up this panel. Iraq surely isn't doing enough in this area, and I think if we go back to the latest budget, is one indication of that. The non-oil investments still less than oil-related investments. And I think Iraq really has a problem of moving away for the transitions that many other countries are years ahead. Green transition, for instance, capturing flared gas, et cetera, et cetera. But there is another part here, which I think the political class is also struggling with. It is not just diversifying the economy beyond the oil sector, it is also diversifying the reliance of a large segment of the population on government revenue. So to this day, and Delaware alluded to that, a significant part of the population is reliant on government salaries, meaning that they don't necessarily engage in other forms of generating money, such as small to medium businesses, which are also lacking very much in government support. And again, I think that Iraq is doing a lot when it comes to signaling internationally that it is open for business, trying to attract investors, whether they are from the region or beyond, but it is not putting in its own investments in equal measure. So Ranj mentioned the development road, for instance. Iraq has done a great job also bringing in the Emiratis and the Qataris on this. But again, if you look at the budget makes no mention of the development road. So it's also a question of like, what is Iraq investing itself in making sure that you at least start parts of these projects to attract further investment. And then, I mean, lastly, I think that Iraq is also struggling on another front, which is, of course, water. And maybe on that part is the only place where they've seen the use of being able to trade its oil riches for that. And we've seen that also as a part of a recent agreement with Turkey, for instance. But this is not a very creative way of diversifying away, obviously, from oil, and a lot more is required.
Thank you. I have another question for Delaware. This is like the big question on Iraq's international positioning. Of course, it's kind of caught between Iran and the US. What is your assessment of how well Iraq is trying to balance those two alliances and the road ahead?
Well, Iraq had a very tough time recently until the last couple of years. We had difficult neighbors, very difficult to deal with, and they had complex agendas. And being a fragile country, we were subject to all sorts of interventions and manipulations. But we also had the global power competition in action in Iraq, and still. But we also had regional power versus global power, Iran and US, for example. So we had this difficult time to go through. But recently there has been a transformation where Turkey failed in zero problem with neighbors. We are now getting into that position of not zero, but minimized, reduced. So this Iraqi government initially was received by the United States with suspicion, because they saw that it's actually the product of the coordination framework that is dominated by pro-Iranian groups, including PMF, and the alliance that was meant to be more like Iraq-focused was dismantled. But then very quickly, they managed to get the US engaged, reassured, and the Iraqi government complied with all the sanctions as well as the limitations that they had imposed on Iraq for engaging or exchanging money with Iran. And the United States really needed Iraq to be more stable and needed to stay in Iraq. The toughest negotiation with the United States was actually on the troops, whether they would stay or not. And for the United States, this became a strategic issue for all sorts of reasons, not just fighting ISIS, which is important for regional stability, and it is a cross-border challenge, but also for Americans' own interest in the region. They needed Iraq, and they needed Iraq for Syria as well. This was a tough negotiation that took months and now got into a good stage. The Americans also changed tactics in engaging Iraq and to enhance institutions, to have economic, cultural, and other developments, and offering investment in environment and so on. So the relationship became mutually kind of respectful and rewarding. The level of understanding between the deep state, the administrations have been really at its peak. With Iran was more difficult because Iran's influence had been overwhelming at times, and they considered it their back garden. They just did things. And for this government to actually convert Iran or transform the relationship and making them think before they carry on like before, it was tough, but it worked. For example, the Prime Minister went to Iran and said, look, we have such so much in common. You're so important to us. We really want to have great relations, but it should not be at the expense of the Americans. It's not our job to be part of that agenda. He did exactly the same in America. Said strong relations with the US should not be at the expense of Iranians. And both sides gave Iraq space. And both actually accepted, and of course it's in Iran's interest to have Iraq more stable, because Iran is benefiting from Iraq more than any other country. So that again translates into the current situation where who's protecting Iraq's impartiality or avoiding the war. With it, what helped was Iraq was able to deliver on its obligations to Iran, while reminding Iran that its failure to do more is because of the international law or because of American sanctions. What helped immensely was the transformation in relationship with the Gulf. This government, again, in the same context, was seen with suspicion by the Gulf states for the same reason, but gradually they managed to really engage each other economically, politically, and the Gulf also learned the lesson of not really being engaged or entangled and interfering too much with internal politics, that every time it failed. So anybody who designed any policy to interfere with Iraq's details and state, non-state actors, as well as sub-state actors, they will fail. It's tough. Relations between Baghdad and Turkey was also transformed. Turkey saw suddenly there's huge opportunities, and whatever they did in Baghdad didn't work. They made it worse for themselves. So they gradually saw that there are opportunities to agree on security, while this is their primary concern. Of course, they have securitized the relationship and they still have invaded Iraq, but this is not going to be forever, and they're subject to discussion. Iraq needs Turkey for water, for road development, for good relations, for security, and many other, because Turkey could easily be the hub for trade between Europe and Iraq. So Turkey's approach changed, and Iraq also tried very hard to get the Turks on board, because Iraq realizes their importance. And again, it should not be at the expense of the Iranians and so on. So if you look around, relationship between every country around, and we have many neighbors, some of them are more difficult than others, relations calm down. Things are becoming more real. And it's based on mutual interest, based on mutual understanding, and mutual interest extends into economy, into investment, and obviously there were other countries that came in and helped in that. So if you look at the prospect of the future, if the current Iraqi government or its policies stay on, the Gulf are actually even more interested. And for the first time in the last year, we've seen real money coming in from the Gulf. In the past, even the Turks used to send all their companies, but not their money with it. It was always Iraqi money going outwards, but not investment from abroad. So the Gulf have actually transformed the spirit, even for the global partners, including America. They're helping in more than one way. So they're coming in, no longer that risk averse. They bring their money and they really want this to work. Remember, some Gulf countries, not all, didn't want Iraq to actually recover. Didn't want Iraq to build a new port, build the development road. And of course, some have doubts about the PMF wanting that, or the Iranians wanting that. But the government has managed to negotiate its way until everybody seems to be supportive of that new development and new stability. everything happened in Iraq is related to the international dimension, regional and global. And every sub-state or non-state actor is transnational and has its links outside the government with international engagement. So that means moving Iraq on this real difficult path. It took a lot of nuanced or say sophisticated approach, but you can look back, compare now with 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the progress is palpable. And this is where the optimism comes for the future.
Thank you. You mentioned Turkey, so I'm going to come to you, Ranj, and ask you to maybe explore this theme of better relations with Turkey. How is that relationship evolving, and why does it matter for Iraq?
Well, Turkey is a major regional actor, the bridge between East and West in many ways. And I think under the Trump administration, Turkey will be playing an even greater role, not just in Iraq, in the region, given that it has interests in Syria, which overlaps with Iraq as a conflict landscape. And we might actually see the Iraqi and Syrian landscapes combine, with one determining the fate of the other, given that we're now in a state where conflict in the region is very transnational. And the PMF comes into that as well. I think Turkey will probably reassert its position, its influence with the Kurdistan regional government, which for a long time has constituted Turkey's, a major pillar in Turkey's regional security architecture. So we'll see increased involvement there between the Turks and Kurdistan. I should add in that context that in the Trump administration, there's probably going to be 3 or 4 individuals at most who will be shaping Iraq's policy. And these individuals know Iraq very well. They have some scores to settle with the likes of the PMF, and they know they've got 4 years potentially to, in their perspective, correct some wrongs. And they'll be looking at the region as a whole to see who can help them in that effort. Turkey is one of those countries which will be central to these individuals, to the administration's attempts to move Iraq away from the Iranian orbit of influence, to execute security objectives in coordination with the likes of Israel. Some security objectives there actually align with the security objectives of the Gulf states. But the Gulf states are tired of confrontation, conflict, and disruption with the Iranians. That's why we saw the Saudis engage in that peace deal with the Houthis, which remarkably in some ways has still stood. I think we're going to see perhaps cooperation when it comes to intelligence sharing. In northern Iraq, the Turks have a very strong presence in their campaign against the PKK and its affiliates. So what we're really going to see is a combination of political, security, and economic in order to fulfill objectives within both Iraq and Syria itself. But let me just add finally that Iraq's future is one of 3 countries: Syria, in the sense that it could become engulfed in civil war. The fact that Syria has seen a decline in conflict, putting that to one side. It could be Yemen, where military force from outside actors like the Americans and the Israelis will be concentrated on one main actor. In Yemen, it's the Houthis. In Iraq, we might see a replica of that targeted at the likes of the PMF and the ilk. And the third is Libya, so where you've got competing centers of power, competing centers of gravity, with some calm, a deceptive calm, a fragile calm at that, but nonetheless with eruptions of conflict and political tensions every now and again.
Thank you. As you mentioned, Iraq's domestic politics often shapes its international stand. And Lahiba, I have a question for you. What role are Iranian supported militias shaping Iraq's foreign policy in the region, particularly when it comes to the war in Gaza and Lebanon?
Okay, so first of all, I would like to infuse some nuance when it comes to the PMF, right? So I think there's a very clear trend that we've seen crystallize over the last year in terms of how these groups that are linked to the PMF as an institution have reacted to the war in Gaza. It is very clear that the so-called Iraqi Islamic resistance comprise 3 groups. Those, you can call them the more extreme groups with the lead of Kataib Hezbollah, but actually the bulk of them are not necessarily involved in the attacks that we're seeing that these groups are conducting, either against Israel or at an earlier stage against US bases in Iraq and Syria, right? So I think that to some degree, the government has been able to lean on a part of this, or the main part of this institution actually being a part of the state. I mean, there's been a long-standing discussion in Iraq whether this has been a positive or a negative development. But I think that it does give the state some leverage, and we've seen that in an earlier phase of the war. So for instance, in January, when we had 3 US soldiers being killed by Iraqi groups in Jordan, the Iraqis, because of their good relations with their neighbors, including with Iran, were actually able to lean in and say, look, we need to stop this now. The level of escalation between these groups and the Americans have gone too far. I'm not saying that this will stand if things in the region escalate further. It is certainly a concern when it comes to the question of whether Israel will strike or not strike Iraq. Potentially, or most likely, the truce between the Americans and these groups will then crash. But I think that the government has been able to have a very clear position of its own. It is calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. It is supporting, and in Lebanon for that matter, it is supporting with humanitarian aid. It is receiving people from these theaters to help them in country. It is able to do all of that. What it is not able to do is to impact the actions of these 3 specific groups, and especially when it comes to what they do outside of the borders of Iraq, right? They have a presence in Syria. And so what we've seen is, for as long as you can contain the conflict or the escalation to the Syrian theater, and there's already precedents of that even before 7 October, Iraq is fairly shielded. Now, what's going to happen under the Trump administration is a big question mark. But I think for now, this equation has somewhat worked.
So since you mentioned the Trump administration and the security situation, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question straight away. You know, the United States will withdraw almost all of its 2,500 troops from Iraq over the next year. Just a few months earlier, the head of the US Central Command said that should US forces leave before the Iraqi counterparts could secure the nation, it would all but guarantee ISIS's return. Now, what do you think are the security, political, and strategic implications of this planned withdrawal of the remaining US troops from the country?
I mean, for sure, there are still risks related to ISIS in Iraq. But I would say that actually the bigger risk for Iraq is what happens in Syria, because that part is still not under control in that sense. I mean, we've seen a prison break, right? There are still Al Hol camp and a few other smaller camps that hold thousands of people. So the mission in Iraq, yes, the withdrawal timeline is September next year. But the Syria part of the mission is supposed to go on until 2026. A lot of things can happen between now and then, obviously. And also, I mean, the other important part to remember here is that we're talking about the international coalition. We are not necessarily talking about US troop presence, right? There could be another security arrangement that allows for US troops to stay. The NATO mission, for instance, will stay. There can be another constellation that makes up for that current presence.
Thank you. And Adlawar, I have a question for you, going back to kind of domestic politics. Of course, one of the big domestic issues is the relationship between Baghdad and the semi-autonomous Kurdish regional government. What would you say, how would you characterize the relationship right now? And what would you say are the biggest bones of contentions, of points of disagreement between Erbil and Baghdad?
Well, the relationships have evolved, obviously, slightly better than before. Again, the 2 governments are talking more often, and they visit, they address issues that can be addressed between them. But the fundamental problems and divisions remain. they have not been able to solve the problems or institutionalize the relationship. Both sides have been very selective in translating the constitution into action. It is obviously Baghdad's job and the parliament to make sure that the constitution is implemented and these relationships, what I mentioned earlier, center periphery, it's not just with Kurdistan, with everyone. Like, for example, we need a hydrocarbon law or law for all national assets to be amicably divided between center and periphery. People in Basra are more demanding a hydrocarbon law and their share of the oil, that they are actually the biggest resource holders as well as reserve holders as well as exporters. So basically this has not been addressed. We need legislations and so on. So the trust between Baghdad and Erbil goes up and down, and under this government has gone up, but actually they have not dealt with the budget issue that is the most contentious. The Iraqi government, after years of seeing Kurdistan exporting oil independently, has managed to stop that, but then they are not compensating for that, and they're not addressing it in any urgency because it suits them not to have Kurdish oil going out because Iraq meets the OPEC quota. And the salaries are being paid with pain. So it's not been easy, and in whether it's people or the government of Kurdistan, they are frustrated for the fact that all these pledges are not delivered because the Prime Minister wants it delivered and the institutions and the barriers are great. So basically, when it comes to budget, oil, disputed territories where they should be coordinating efforts and solving problems which are getting worse instead, on security, on even on tariff, even on traffic of material. So all of these things have been suspended. So yes, this Baghdad Erbil current government relationship is improved, but actually these issues are still outstanding because we have a parliament that obviously it's their job to deal with the budget law as well as come up with new legislations for all the other things. And they are not prioritizing that. Instead, they go for the marriage underage, for example. They go for banning alcohol, but they're not going for these big things. So these structural problems will remain for some time, but the goodwill between individuals and governments transform the feeling, but not translate into absolutely tackling the root causes of the problem. So we expect that in the next year, these negotiations will continue. But unfortunately, when it comes to talking about Baghdad, you're not talking about just the Prime Minister as being the ultimate decision maker. It's in a whole establishment that is not necessarily built like a modern state, and decisions are scattered. And Kurdistan itself has problems. Neither Kurdistan region and the parties were able to go to Baghdad and own it, consider it their own, and then act as though they own it and integrate themselves fully with Baghdad. Conversely, Baghdad did not embrace Kurdistan to treat them like full Iraqi first-class citizens. So this means both sides failed to make it work, but the onus is naturally on Baghdad because that's where the parliament, the government, and the sovereign powers are to make all the periphery happy, not just Kurdistan, but every governorate who are sharing Kurdistan's problems throughout, have been throughout the period and for some time to come.
Thank you. And now my last question is for Ranj on a completely different type of challenge for Iraq, which is climate change. I remember being in Baghdad it was August, it was very hot, it was like 50 degrees. So I can imagine, it was a powerful reminder of the way climate change is affecting daily life there and elsewhere. How do you think it is and will be changing Iraq's future climate change?
Well, let's put it this way. It's not at the very top of the list of priorities that Iraq has. And that's for good reason, in fact. You just have to look at Italy, the UK where I'm from, America. and how contentious the debate on net zero targets and climate change is. It has had a polarizing impact, in fact, on societies in the West. So if that's the case for advanced economies, democracies, you can only imagine what it could be like in a war-torn or a country like Iraq, which has experienced countless wars over the past decade. But nonetheless, the decision makers, in fact, credit to them, have actually put climate change on the national agenda. And I think that applies to both Baghdad and the Kurdistan region. Iraq is, I think, the fifth most vulnerable country to the effects of climate change in the world, for the reasons you've outlined. And it ties into other major crises, which are, in fact, at the very top of the list of priorities, such as the water crisis, access to water. That also has a geopolitical dimension of it because of the so-called water conflict or tensions between Iraq and Turkey. And in fact, anytime a Turkish delegation goes to Baghdad, the water crisis is tied into other questions, such as the question of the PKK and other security issues. In Kurdistan, they've actually sort of reformed, not just reacted, not just by adopting policies, developing committees to look into the effects and how it can be addressed, but also by hiring personnel that are tasked with developing, formulating policies to react to it. So the Prime Minister's office has an entire team dedicated to the effects of climate change in Kurdistan, and that is within the Prime Minister's office itself. In Baghdad, we're seeing Prime Minister Soudani reaffirm the issue geopolitically. But look, domestically, it's difficult to implement a sustainable, effective climate change agenda when you've got political crises domestically, but not just political crises as you would have it in the West, for example, but potentially violent political crises. Number one, you've got a geopolitical escalation, transnational conflict unfolding, which could grip the country at large. You've got 700 to 800,000 Iraqi graduates who need jobs every year. Severe degradation within the society. And so it's tricky sometimes finding a space when it comes to both bandwidth and capturing the public's attention.
Do Iraqis talk about this? Is it an issue on people's minds? Is it affecting their daily life or not so much?
So I'd say climate change expresses itself in different ways in a country like Iraq. It's not necessarily, we've got to address climate change because of its impact, it's the devastation it creates, but rather there's a reason why I don't have access to water. There's a reason why we have a crisis or issues with this particular country. The second order effects of climate change are actually amplified within the national debate that unfolds on a daily basis. And there's an entire class of civil society activists who, again, credit to them, have done a fantastic job of raising awareness of climate change and making sure it stays in the public space and that it remains a national topic. So no government in Iraq, whether it's in Kurdistan or Baghdad, can ignore climate change as a topic. And finally, it's actually helping Iraq be part of a wider global discussion and debate. So in terms of its international posturing, its soft power, climate change is very crucial to any administration, whether in Erbil or Baghdad.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists. That brings our session to an end. And thank you. Thank you so much.
Let's take a photo.
Yeah.
Gelato 1.